On occasion, we have one of these big stories in the news when a company engages in fraud and it kind of explodes. It scares everybody that the system might be fragile surrounding that company. And here I'm talking about situations like FTX and like Theranos and way back there was Enron. So with that category of thing, what tends to be the case is that the CEO or else perhaps a small group of people around the CEO become bottlenecks of information where nobody really knew what was going on inside the company. And when everything comes out, it turns out that there's fraud, that there's stuff going on that nobody expected. And one of my problems with this sort of situation is that it should not be about the CEO. Like, if I have to trust that a CEO is always telling the truth and that they're not sort of a conniving sociopath or whatever who's intentionally trying to hide information, then our system doesn't work well. Like, we should not have to rely on single individuals to maintain the integrity of the system. In fact, if you look at the broader system, it's designed to sort of prevent that kind of thing. Because there's no amount of jail time, there's no punishment that could be sort of geared at these CEOs or these people who were the frauds that would stop that from happening in the future. We really need other parts of our system that hold in check the powers of a CEO. So I would actually like to build a map of systems like this. And that is the whole system, the whole ecosystem around companies, to think about when something like this happens in the future, where's the problem? Like, where is the system failing to do its job? And how can we make sure that the next time something like this happens, that we learn from our mistakes, that we figure out where on the map of the system should we be focusing our attention? Okay, so the map is going to have a whole bunch of players within the system. We've got our board of directors, we've got our CEO, we've got managers on different levels moving down. Of course, companies tend to have this pyramid structure where at the very bottom of the pyramid is the workers who are actually doing the work. And then when I talk about a bottleneck of information, it's where all of the information about the company sort of goes up through the CEO who's not telling the truth. That's the situation we want to make sure doesn't happen too often in our economy. Now let's turn to the shareholders. So one of the benefits of our system is that there's all kinds of shareholders who are all looking at different information when they make their decision about how much they think the firm is worth. And we've got institutional shareholders who are managing pools of stocks from different companies who are really managing a lot of people's 401ks, and they do this professionally. And then we also have individual shareholders who are just people who like to buy and sell stocks, who watch different indicators to make those decisions, who sort of enjoy watching the market. And one of the great things is that all of these people think differently, and they're all looking at different pieces of information, which will help strengthen the system. I think a lot of what we want here is diversification of information sources and diversification of how people interpret the many, many information sources out there. So then our next thing to put on the map is going to be the many sources of information about that company. And I might start with journalists, where there's different types of journalists. There's going to be journalists who exist within institutions like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. And then we have journalists who are independent journalists, sort of out there doing their thing. And of course, there's advantages and disadvantages to both of those types. So it's really healthy that we have different types of journalists who will emphasize different things. Now, over here, we might put our auditors and our regulators and people whose job it is to go inside the company and look at the books and make sure that everything happening within that company is legal and fair and accurate. So that's another class of people, and there's lots of different people in that category. Then over here, we might put our data analysts. And these can be people who work inside other companies that are analyzing the industry or the market. These can be people who perhaps are professors. There's lots of different types of data analysts, but they take data and they process it and they look for patterns. And somewhere in between our auditors and our data analysts, we might have these private companies that put out ratings of different firms where they've analyzed the data and they're scoring systems based on historic data. Firms that sort of rate companies as AAA or whatnot, those kinds of firms are also providing new information here. Then we have our market watchers. And I kind of have pictured in my head an old person with a newspaper at their table who has watched the market for many, many years and has intuitions about how markets work, how different types of firms respond when the economy is heated up or when it's cooling down. And it's a combination of these people's intuition and their source of information and news that provides new insight into the market. And I think it's also helpful to imagine a young market watcher who really understands technology and understands some of the current trends better, but doesn't have that long history of intuition, so may avoid some of the biases that go with the long history of intuition. And so the young and the old market watchers, they each bring something unique. They each bring a unique way of processing information about the company. Then we have our upstream, downstream firms from the company. So upstream firms, these are firms that sell products to the company. Downstream firms are the customers of the company. And both of those might want information. Both of those have a certain insight, a certain amount of information that they can demand from this company. And that's another way that information leaks out of the company. Because we want really good information and lots of different types of information seeping out to many different places for someone to notice if there's something that's not quite right. And then we have a category of people in this information environment who are just people who know people. So this could be people who know the CEO, people who know the managers, people who know the workers. And they have an insight about the character of each of those people. They may get nuggets about what's going on inside the firm, how management is working, and that information sort of seeps out through various sources and may end up as information these shareholders can watch out for. So that's our map. Now let's just stop to admire how well-functioning this system is designed to be. So we can see that there's these feedback loops of information that are designed to capture sort of the full picture of the firm. Like the auditors are going to notice something that might be questionable, ask for more information, create an incentive for people inside the company to improve things. So that's one type of feedback loop. And of course, all of these are information feedback loops. Like this map is an information map. But we have that kind of feedback loop going on all over the place. Like the journalists have relationships with people inside the firm. They call up and have real conversations. They process that information. The data analysts, they have a sort of relationship with the firm, particularly if they put out public reports where they're processing, where they're publishing different types of data. And that feedback loop can kind of hold companies in check to some degree. And really, every single one of these players is putting out information, receiving information. People within the company may respond to that information environment. And everybody is looking at different parts of the company, different types of information. We might come down here to the people who know people group and recognize that they have this squishy kind of information, which is about how well are the managers in the firm getting along, what's their character, how honest are these people, what's their patterns, how might the human dynamic inside the firm interact with the data output from the firm. So we have lots and lots of different types of information with many feedback loops. Now, let me return to my original question, which is, how do we get situations like this where there seems to be a bottleneck of information through the CEO? Like, how does that happen? Because really, for that to happen, we need some of the players who are in this system to not be doing their job. We need some of these feedback loops to be distorted in ways that nobody's recognized. And of course, if you have a situation that's got a bottleneck, just like we have with some of these fraud cases, then what's oftentimes going on is that CEO and the upper management team are making sure that nobody leaks out information unless it goes through the CEO in a tightly controlled feedback loop. Now, in a well-functioning system, the hope would be that these journalists and these data analysts and the people who know people for a glimpse about what's going on inside the firm, all of those might start to recognize that, wait a second, there is a bottleneck, or this information doesn't seem to be coming directly from the managers I would expect. And they might notice that and use that information to discount some of what they're hearing about what's happening inside the firm. Like, we would hope that each player on this map would sort of be trying to intuit, is this information coming directly from the source? Because if one company has successfully pulled off this kind of fraud, everybody does need to ask the question, if you're investing in some other company, how do you know the system is working well to hold that other company in check? Like, how broad is this failure? Is it failure in one case because you've got a brilliant CEO with the bottleneck situation? Or is this the people who are supposed to be holding these companies in check have failed, and we need to go through the system and figure out what are the weak points and how do we beef those up? So it's really about fragility and anti-fragility in the long run, I think, where fragility means that when there's a negative shock to the system, people lose trust. People no longer believe the information that's coming out of these firms, that's coming through all of these players, the auditors, the journalists, the data analysts, because there was something that all of them got wrong together. And the broader that spread of system failure, the more worried we need to be. But of course, if we're talking anti-fragility, one of the questions is, when something like this happens, are we as a system reflecting on how did this happen and how do we prevent it in the future? And this is one of the reasons why I'm frustrated when so much of the media focus is on the personalities, because to really fix it and make sure this doesn't happen in the future, it's not about punishing those personalities. It's about beefing up the people who are the watchers. But of course, there's not a single person in that system who's fully responsible for making sure that information is independent, that information is not going through a bottleneck. That's sort of a collectively shared responsibility. And you certainly can't go through and punish any one of these players. Like, no one individual in this big system has failed. Now, there's some hope here because when something like this happens, I do think there's some self-reflection from all of these players. And they are going to be thinking more about, is this one of those information bottleneck situations?